Coming up next on Futures in Biotech, how understanding our mind will shape our future with Dr. Adam Gazzaley.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Futures in Biotech is provided by Cachefly at cachefly.com.
This is Futures in Biotech, episode 88. Cogito, Ergo Sum. Multitasking?
I believe that
This episode of Futures in Biotech is brought to you by Ford, featuring voice-activated sync, AppLink. Now you can control select smartphone apps with your voice, so you can keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. Check it out in the 2012 Ford Fiesta and at ford.com/technology.
The extension. About 30-40% for humans, that would equate to something like 20 to 30 years.
How close are we to actually having a therapy?
Ballpark, 10 years.
So potentially one of the things that will end up rocking the world the same way that people said, oh, the sun's the center of the universe, oh, this and that and everything. And now here's somebody who can come out and say, hey, look, here's how we compare it to our closest evolutionary relative.
Welcome to Futures in Biotech. During the last show, we had Jeffrey Hangst, who's the head of the Alpha Collaboration at CERN. And he presented the science of capturing antimatter or anti-atoms specifically. And he hopes to use those anti-atoms for determining the symmetry and nature of the universe, which I thought was the biggest question of all, right? But I had an email conversation with our co-host today, Dave Brodbeck. And in that discussion, he was saying that really there's another way to go at the biggest question, and that's to use the approach of Cogito Ergo Sum, I think, therefore I am, which is a more appropriate way to explore the nature of our existence, right? So I got the wrong guest. Today, I think we've got the right guest. So Dave, perhaps you could tell us why you think our guest today, his work explores the nature of our existence. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we were talking today, and it seems to me that one of the key things about being a human is the sort of mental life, the experience we have, and the fact that we have so much stuff going on. There's stuff going on outside, so there's all the sensory and perceptual information, sensory information coming in, becoming perceptual information. Then you've got processing of that, and you've got trying to figure out what all those things mean. Like I look over off camera here, and I got a can of pop, right? And I'm looking at, or soda, as Americans say, and I'm Canadian. And I look at this, and I immediately recognize the pop can. I immediately recognize that it says limonade diète because I'm reading the French side. I read that instantaneously. I didn't have to even worry about recognizing individual letters. I then know what all these things mean. I'm also talking and understanding what I'm saying. The neat thing is, I'm also filtering out a bunch of stuff that is completely irrelevant, right? And not just stuff on the outside. Like I can hear my son upstairs running up and down in the living room. I can hear the fan of my computer, etc. It's not just that. It's also filtering out all the other completely unimportant stuff that's happening inside, sort of the internal noise we have. And I'm able to do that, and it's, to me, my experience is completely seamless. And that, to me, is, in fact, when I teach brain and behavior, which I am doing this term, and I'm hoping some of my students are watching, this is on the exam. I mean, this interview today. The thing I end with, spoiler alert, is I talk about something called the binding problem. How do we put everything together? And frankly, also, how do we ignore all the other junk going around us? And our guest today is does research in this area.
So that kind of defines our human existence.
To me, right? It does, and I think to a lot of people, yeah.
By defining or getting a scope of our consciousness. Well, I'm going to refer back. Okay, so I'm going to have to go listen back to a number of other shows before I listen to this one again, because I always listen to these shows twice. And so we've got Fib 10, Futures Biotech episode 10. We had Carla Schatz, who described brain development, how a brain goes from a single cell to a complete trillion cell complex. We had Fib 20, we had Nobel laureate Eric Kandel, who described how the molecular mechanism for memory. In 33, we had Brenda Milner. Now that one will be a key one too, as background listening, because she was one of the pioneers, or if not the pioneer, in cognitive neuroscience. Episodes 37, 38, we had Marty Chalfie, Nobel laureate for describing how the sensory system or touch at the molecular level, and GFP, of course, that's why he won the Nobel Prize, but he's a fantastic neuroscientist. Fib 44, John Gabrielli, whose work involves imaging emotion by functional MRI. Terry Sinowski in episode 46 was working on algorithms that imitate living organisms and translating them to computers, so computers that think. Justin Sanchez with brain-machine interfaces. Fib 8 on 49. Fib 80 was Anne Grabiel, who's working on learning and cognition by optogenetics. Right. So if you go back and then you add this episode, our guest, Dr. Gazzaley, is really helps tie in all that neuroscience background, and I think it'll be a really fun conversation. Dr. Gazzaley, Adam Gazzaley, is the founding director of the Neuroscience Imaging Center at the University of California in San Francisco. He's an associate professor in neurology, physiology, and psychiatry, and principal investigator of a cognitive neuroscience laboratory studying neural mechanisms of perception, attention, and memory, with an emphasis on distraction and multitasking. So this can explain my work. Okay, so and his research and perspectives have been profiled on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, CNN, TED, Discover, PBS, NPR, NBC Nightly News, and now on Twit. Welcome to the show, Dr. Gazzaley.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So, I don't know, where do we start? Do we start with how the brain works, the functioning of the brain, or perhaps you could give us let's do this. Could you explain a little bit what's your mission? What's your mission in science? And we can work down from there.
Sure. One of the things that really captivates me, and I think you already summarized it a little bit, is how our brains allow us to interact with this extraordinarily complex environment that we live in, as well as our internal environment, which is in many ways equally complex. And from those interactions, we're able to have goal-directed behavior that we're able to successfully carry out in the face of what I would describe as a stream of interference all the time. So I'm interested in how brain areas interact, neural networks, how they lead to this emergent properties of our brains to be able to interact with our environment, and how we can maintain our sense of identity and our ability to accomplish our goals given all the other elements that are going on around us. So that would be the most basic question that we ask in the lab.
Okay, I'm just wondering, is Dave still on?
I'm right here.
Okay, so I've set up a back chat.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, as I was saying in the sort of intro bit, is I don't think a lot of people realize, and I was looking at the chat room, and a lot of people I don't think realize the amount of, well, I guess you'd call it almost, well, like I said, noise that's happening internally and also externally. So if you're trying to filter this stuff out, I mean, if my reading of your stuff is correct, what you're trying to do is figure out how we can sort of I guess, executive function, as people call it. What's the sort of top-down processing that allows us to control all of these kind of things, and how do you look at that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. I guess another way of breaking it down is that how we perceive the world, our perception is not a passive process. The world and our environment doesn't flood into our brains, but there are control processes, attention that shapes our perception. And there are two ways of looking at it. One might be the bottom-up control, external attention. So that's how our environment demands our attention, even independent of our goals. So if there's a flash of light, even if someone quietly calls your name, you pay attention, even if you are not trying to. It's things that are very salient, very novel in the environment demand our attention. And the other type of attention is top-down, goal-directed attention. It's how we control how we perceive the world and how we behave in the world. So all of your all of your elements of your perception are influenced by these two attentional factors, the bottom-up environmental factor and the top-down goal-directed factor. And what we study in our lab is how these influences on how we perceive the world then go and sculpt how we remember it, either in the short term, something we call working memory, or in the longer term. And understanding those interfaces really defines in a lot of ways how you fit into this external environment, how you accomplish your goals either successfully or unsuccessfully.
Right. I mean, when you look at something like, and I think depending on the expertise of the listener or viewer, I don't think people realize that, working memory, or what people used to call short-term memory, is something that lasts, if nothing's processed, it lasts on the order of seconds.
Sure.
So are you also then looking at what people in cognitive psychology call the control processes that, things like anything from, rehearsal to, using the visuospatial sketch pad, things like that, and looking at the neural basis of those things?
Sure, that's exactly what we do. So, top-down modulation, sometimes the term cognitive control is another term that's used, executive functions, and it's basically how given a set of goals that you might have, you're capable of controlling how you process information, despite the fact that there are many irrelevant streams of information going on simultaneously. And another type of interference is that you might be actually trying to process multiple streams of information at the same time, something that is often referred to as multitasking.
Mm-hmm.
So how we try to get a tractable edge on this very complicated problem is using tools of human cognitive neuroscience. So functional MRI, electroencephalography, or EEG, and transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we use those tools to study the functioning human brain while our participants are engaged in experiments that we designed to probe these abilities and these neural processes. So we create paradigms in the lab that are one way of looking at them is they're essentially like video games that you play, you respond, we receive, but while you're doing that, we're recording brain activity in approximately real time to see how patterns of brain connectivity underlie your ability to navigate through these tasks.
Right. Is it actually possible for... Oh, go ahead, Marc.
I'm going to ask a very, very naive question. Okay, so we've been studying the human mind since forever, since I guess we could write, and document it and then pass it on to the next generation where they could take the information, adapt it. And so I'm just going to give very, very general, high level here, 37,000 feet. So what we understand of cognition and, how interference can modify our goals or interrupt our goals, was that science initially established through observations of human behavior? And are those premises now changing based on what you find using imaging techniques like MRI, functional MRI?
Yeah,
or are they solid with those?
No, it's a fantastic question. Obviously, what we know about the brain has been an extension of many years of psychological research where the outcome measures are basically your response time, your accuracy. Sometimes you could use things more complex like psychophysics and have thresholding curves. But at the end of the day, we can't use those tools to see exactly what is happening inside the brain in terms of processing. And especially in terms of some cognitive process, it's even more difficult to interpret exactly what is happening. And one classic example that in my mind that I feel made a lot of headway using neuroimaging and modern technology is the concept of distraction. When you're presented with irrelevant information, there is often no behavior to see. You have to determine the impact of that irrelevant information on the relevant behavior, right? And so it's an interpretation. And a lot of what we have learned based on these psychological experiments are supported by the imaging work that my lab and others have done, but we've definitely added a lot of flavor to it that just wasn't possible to be obtained unless you're actually recording what's going on in the brain when the distraction is present and not having to rely on the behavioral consequences of that distraction to understand what's happening.
It's interesting because when you talk about distraction, I actually have one of my fourth-year honors students is actually working on distraction right now for his thesis. And one of the things that always struck me about the whole idea of being distracted and multitasking, I mean, I wonder, do humans or nervous systems in general, I mean, we know the Hewlings-Jackson principle, right? Massively parallel and hierarchical. But is it the case that we're doing task switching, okay? Or do we actually work on two things at once? I mean, I think back to, dichotic listening experiments. You talk about classic experiments in psychology. And that pretty much shows that we're sort of sampling from the unattended ear, but we still, for the most part, we can't listen to two things at once. Does your sort of imaging work, does it bear this out, or that we really can't do two things at once, or are people really multitasking?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question. Let me first define what I think of as multitasking and distraction, because we have our own terminology that we built a lot in our lab, and a lot of it is based on people's experiences. And we created this framework, and now we address it empirically to see, are these really different processes? So if I start with the basic concept of interference, I say that interference can exist in two main categories. Internal interference, a lot of what you talked about, that internal noise that we are aware of, mind wandering, things of that nature, and external interference. And then I break external interference and also internal interference into two different types that are based on goals. So and they could be the same stimuli. So and the two ways I break them down, the first way is what I call distraction. So I use distraction very specifically to mean irrelevant information that is outside of the framework of our goal that we're trying to ignore. So you're at a restaurant, you're having a conversation, all the noise around you is interfering with your ability to engage deeply in what you're listening to. If you have any hopes of remembering the details of that, you just try to ignore it. That's a distraction. You could have that same type of stimuli, but now instead of trying to ignore it, you're trying to engage it as a secondary task. That's what we think of as multitasking. So it could be the same stimuli. Now you're in the restaurant, but instead of ignoring it, you're trying to listen to the waiter to say the dinner specials at the next table, and at the same time have a conversation. So, and this can all happen internally. You can be trying to have a conversation with someone, but your mind wanders against your will. That would be an internal distraction. Or maybe you're talking to them, but also planning what you're going to do later that evening, and that would be sort of internal multitasking. So I divide, and our lab has addressed these different types of interference. So to answer your question, so multitasking is when you are engaged in a task, let's just for sake of argument call it the primary task, and then another task comes along. We'll call that the secondary task, just for giving terms to these things. When you engage in the secondary task, what we find in our lab, so we tend to study these things in the context of memory, working memory. So let's say the primary task is to hold something in mind for a short period of time, for seconds. A picture of a face. And then the interrupting task is another face that comes along that you have to make a decision about, like how old is this person? And then you go about the task of trying to answer the memory question. So this is the type of thing you might do in the real world, for example, if you leave the couch to get something out of the refrigerator, and along the way you're interrupted by something, a phone call, and then you find yourself in front of the refrigerator and you have no idea what you're doing there, right? This is a very common sort of memory glitch that we experience. You know you have the capacity to remember that one item, but something interfered with that. And so to answer your question, what we find when we do brain imaging, functional brain imaging, during the exact experiment that I just described, hold a single item in mind for 7 seconds, but in the middle, we're going to interrupt you with another task. And when we compare that to the case when we don't interrupt you, what we find is that you are switching. The network, which involves the front part of the brain and the visual parts of the brain, is essentially broken by that interrupting task and then has to be reactivated. So it fits this idea that multitasking doesn't really exist, what some people think of as multitasking being a myth, because when the processing involves deep resources, right, when it's not something that's automatic or reflexive like walking and chewing gum and that analogy, but when it's something that actually demands processing resources, you tend to switch between your tasks. And with that switch comes a cost, and that's why you get a decrement in the performance and whatever your primary task is. So that was a long answer, but your question is yes, we see in our data all the time that when it's actually not just distracting information that you're trying to ignore, but multitasking, it involves switching.
It's kind of fun because in the back channel here, I'm guiding some questions. I'm going to so I don't interrupt. I interrupted Dave's line of questioning. So well, let's see if he remembers what his question was. So you're giving us the tools and the actual data that tells us that we can not yell at our kids, but sort of strongly suggest that they turn off the TV while they're doing their homework. right? That if something comes up that's of interest to them, there's a cost in their, unless the kids are just so good at it, and we can't do it because we're old. Right?
Yeah, I think it's probably the former. I think that if you are trying to do something that demands high quality, and you want to accomplish it at the optimal level you're capable of, your best chance is focused attention on that. And that with bringing on another stream of information, another task, there's going to be a cost to be paid in performance. And I think that is the general consensus across many labs, both looking at it, with pure behavioral experiments and those looking at it with imaging experiments, that is what happens. And so there's a choice to be made when you engage in multiple streams of information. Oh, sorry, let me turn that phone off. Which is exactly what occurs more and more. I think that there's really provocative surveys of especially children of how they tend to use media in an incredibly rich and what might seem to some people as insane multitasking way of using up to sometimes 7 different devices at the same time. I think that that's what we're beginning to appreciate more and more has a very real cost in performance.
It just reminds me of what happened today in the meeting I was in before I came here, because I was in a meeting and I actually leaned over and said to my friend, I wish these people would all shut up. I'm trying to read the Steve Jobs biography on my iPad.
Now people know, Dave, what you do at the Senate
I don't
meetings.
care. I'm tenured, Mark. What are they going to fire me?
That's right. Well, hey, so I want to explore the breadth of that concept a little bit because outside necessarily the potential framework of that study, and then I want to get back into the study and some of the details.
Sure.
But my question is, for example, I'll give you an example. When I'm writing, it always seems like I'm more productive when I've blurred out all the third level distractions by maintaining a loud level of music without lyrics. And then again, when I put music with lyrics, I get distracted. Music without lyrics, for example, some Baroque piano, or something very, very melodically simple and loud. It tunes everything else out, and then I can work. Or I can pick up my laptop, go to a cafe and get work done there because the general noise, for some reason, keeps me awake enough to be focused, but it blurs out any other distractions. Or, for example, when somebody's trying to talk to you and you're writing, it's impossible. Where does that all fit in with scope of distraction being beneficial versus distractions that are non-beneficial towards productivity?
It's a fantastic question. We know little about that. I've actually spent a good amount of time diving into the literature and trying to understand that seemingly, strange concept that people would put themselves in a distracting environment to do something that actually demands a high level of attention. I call it the coffee shop experiment. We actually just received funding to study that exact phenomena in the lab through some controlled experiments with brain recordings. It flies in the face of a tremendous amount of evidence that irrelevant information, whether it's simultaneously presented or even sequentially presented, whether it's in the same modality, sensory modality, even in a different modality, has an impact, an interference that it causes on your goal. So why would people seek out an incredibly distracting environment to do something that was attentionally demanding? My hypothesis for that experiment that we're doing now to really explore that, because I don't think we know the answer for sure, is that when you are distracted, as I described before, this distraction could happen internally or it can happen externally. If you ask people, they describe that especially people that like to work in coffee shops, they describe that when they're in a very silent environment like a library, they are internally distracted. Their mind wanders. And so my idea and the hypothesis for this is that there is a common mechanism that engages suppression of irrelevant information, whether it's internal or external. And so when you put yourself in a modestly noisy environment, and there will be certain environments that exceed this, but what it does is it causes you to have to suppress that external noise, and in turn causes the internal noise to be suppressed. So you have less internal distraction, and now you're more capable of focusing on your goals. That's the hypothesis of why it might be beneficial. Of course, if the noise, the external noise, overwhelms your ability to suppress it, for instance, lyrics or things that actually demand interaction, then it does no good, right? Then it actually causes interference in itself. So at least this is the idea that we're trying to explore now through some experiments to see if this is really what's going on, or is it that people just like being in coffee shops, and although they take a hit in their performance from being there, for them it's worth it, because if they weren't in a more interactive environment, they just wouldn't do what they needed to do in the first place, which is the alternative hypothesis that it's just detrimental.
It could be just detrimental, but the person's not motivated to do their be productive and do their task if they're not satisfied that they're gaining something else, like being social, out of it, perhaps.
Exactly. That's possible. It's possible that what we'll find is that everyone takes a hit when you put yourself in a noisy environment, and some people just choose to do it because of the other benefits of being in that environment. But it is also possible that there might be some real benefits of having to block out a little bit of external distraction, and that might quiet down the internal noise just a bit, that allows you to find that sweet spot and engage. One thing along these lines that's interesting as an observation is that you see it's largely younger people that tend to do this. And I've been looking in a lot of coffee shops at this. And our data, we've had a lot of studies published over the last 10 years showing that the ability to resist the negative impact of distraction declines as we get older. And so irrelevant information that might have been possible to shut out in a younger person becomes overwhelming and decreases performance in an older adult. And so it's possible that maybe that plays into this observation that older individuals do not get that benefit of being in that noisy environment because it just becomes an interference in itself. I actually just gave a talk last night to an audience of largely older adults, and I brought up this. Actually, it was raised in the audience about this concept of the coffee shop, and you could see everyone just nodding their heads that they don't like to do that. They don't want to be working in coffee shops.
Well, I mean, this reminds me, in fact, when you mentioned coffee shops, I mean, and people being and distraction and all this. I mean, you think about one of the sort of explanations of the some of the detriments that decline that happens with aging, which apparently I'm starting to have because I'm losing my train of thought. But the sort of decline might, it could be just general cognitive slowing, but a lot of it is there's this whole notion out there that it's the inability to not pay attention to unimportant information. Would there be a way perhaps to train people, almost sort of a exercise to allow people to still be able to do this kind of control, to allow them to weed out the unimportant information?
Well, you guys ask great questions. That's exactly what we're interested in. So we've spent around the last 10 years documenting that older adults have difficulty with distracting irrelevant information, and they also have difficulty multitasking, and this has negative consequences both in their working memory and the long-term memory. And we've shown the mechanisms of this using fMRI and EEG and now TMS. And after having told this story for several years, I just started feeling like the doomsayer of what it means to get older. And what it means to get older is not necessarily to be 60, but we see a lot of these things occurring after the age of 20, right? Aging is a lifelong process, and we see that these fluid abilities are impacted across the lifespan. So we became interested in trying to use our knowledge of how the system works, use our brain imaging tools, and some of the paradigms that we developed to study distraction multitasking to see if we could design exercises to exactly as you said, to see if we can improve these abilities, fine-tune an individual's ability to engage in multiple streams of information, to rapidly switch between tasks. And the big goal of that is that if you learn how to better resolve interference in this exercise that I'll tell you a little bit more about, that it would transfer, that the ability to resolve interference would become a skill that you now had, and that it would lead to benefits across your life because interference impacts almost everything, all forms of cognition, so that we might see that they have better memory abilities in the context of interference, not because they train their memory, but because they train their ability to block out and to better deal with interference. So the tack that we've been taking, and we're we finished around 2 years of experimentation on this, all of which is unpublished that we're getting ready to write up right now, is been to create a video game format and try to make it more engaging and immersive than a lot of classic brain training experiments, which are really largely cognitive paradigms with some gamified elements. But if we could really make a 3D immersive video game that has all of the capture and enjoyment that really allows people to immerse themselves, we would gain a deeper depth of change in the brain. So that is exactly what we're trying to do now, and we're trying to validate that using the scientific approach, and also to see if we can use brain imaging to understand the mechanisms of our ability to change interference resolution abilities.
And this game would be something you guys would develop. It wouldn't be like you'd just be throwing Modern Warfare 3 in at people.
No. We're developing it from the ground up, from scratch. And the reason for that is control. We want to have control over the timing down to the millisecond level, the visual field. And that's not just for the training elements, but we are using these video games inside the scanner now and with EEG recording so that we can understand not just the training, but what are the mechanisms of interference so that we can understand how to make better interventions. So in order to put a video game in the scanner, you need all those controls. You need the timing so that you could have these event-related markers. You need to be able to control things at a very fine level. So we're not using commercially available video games, but we're trying to develop our own.
Can you do me a small favor? Yeah. Can you lean your monitor or your webcam up so that we can see what's above your head? Keep going, keep going. That's really great. I just want to show the audience here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 24.
There's another set
oh my
over there.
God, there's more. A whole bunch of. Somebody went to the Apple Store. Hey, I'm going to take this minute to distract everyone, and I'm going to. We have one ad. We'd like to thank our sponsor. So I'd like to. Mention that this episode of Futures in Biotech is brought to you by Ford, available voice-activated Sync app link. Sync app link enables you to control select apps from your smartphone with simple voice commands, and allows you to keep your hands on the wheel and keep your eyes on the road, which kind of relevant to today's discussion. I mean, Ford is moving down the road here with technology that allows you to minimize your distractions, and perhaps they could learn a little bit from some of your studies on brain function here to tailor their Sync app link. But I'm sure they've read your work. I'm sure of it. And so let me tell our audience a little bit more about Sync app link. The things you can do voice control of Pandora in your car. You can listen to your tweets with Open Break just by asking with simple voice commands. For example, you can say. When you've got Pandora switched on, you can say select. You can select your favorite station. You can make a new one. You can bookmark songs for future purchase. Give songs a thumbs up, thumbs down. The commands can include play station, classic rock, or bookmark station, thumbs up, thumbs down. Or in Open Break, you can say things like read timelines or read replies. Sync app link is built on an API platform that allows Ford to continue working with developers in the app community to bring apps to life with voice in their vehicles, which is, I think, really cool. And I mean, I worry about it when I think about my kids driving, having a smartphone, even worse distraction. Voice-activated Sync app link is available on the Ford Fiesta 2012, and you can learn more about this and other technologies from Ford by visiting ford.com/technology. I'd also like to mention that Ford is sponsoring the Twit Sunday barbecues. There's going to be a barbecue on November 13th and Sunday, December 4th, at 1:30 p.m. You'll get to meet some hosts, eat, maybe check out some new Fords. You'll have a seat for the recording of Twit in studio, which will be a lot of fun. And if you'd like to join us, go to twit.tv and request tickets. We'd love to see you there. I'd like to thank Ford for bringing us the Twit Sunday barbecues. All right, so I have two questions. One, why are you talking to us? Why aren't you in the lab? Because these questions seem so fundamental to the inner workings of the human brain that, I mean, I appreciate I appreciate you coming to talk to us. Don't go. Just, but so
Get back to work.
A Beatmaster in the audience was asking, when we were having that discussion about positive distractions or what we think may be negative distractions, but at a costly negative distraction. Are there any positive sounds or tones or things that can activate parts of the brain that will then turn them into positive influences on the goal, on achieving the goal?
I don't know a lot of research in that. I think it's really interesting. There has been some associations, or at least some research attempted at music in general as being another type of what might seem to be a distraction but have some beneficial effects. Although the research is definitely, from my read, we haven't done music research on this, although I find it fascinating, and I often listen to research and music in the background. But some of the research shows that it is still a distraction and might not improve performance. And as far as just simple auditory signals, I'm not aware of anything that might be an aid, but it's an interesting question.
I think we should continue along the discussion of creating a cyber environment that allows you to get people immersed into a three-dimensional universe and then provide them with distractions that you can control and then play around with those parameters to really get an understanding of our human limits or our human possibilities. Then I'd like to get into some of the morphology, some of the brain structures that are allowing us to circumvent some of these issues or are relevant. I'd even like to know would there eventually be possible therapeutics for those that are easily distracted or where people have syndromes of constant distraction. Where we could go in and based on how you've defined the problem and move it towards a clinical, not just an understanding of the human mind, but a clinical application. So perhaps we can get back into the computer universe. So what are you doing? How are you setting this up? Did you hire a bunch of postdocs that are tremendously good coders? Are you collaborating with companies that are doing gaming?
It's a great question. So our first attempt at this was I happen to have the fortune of living in the Bay Area, which is a seeding ground of a lot of innovation across many domains, biotech, high tech, and the video game industry. And I just happen to have a lot of friends that are video game professionals, work at lots of different high-powered video game companies in the Bay Area that were really interested in using their incredibly advanced skill sets that have largely been used to develop entertainment software to be involved in developing software that might be used to understand the brain and also to develop therapeutics that might even have clinical relevance. So we would have these wonderful meetings in our lab pretty regularly, or at least once a month, where I would bring my postdocs and my graduate students, and they would sit around the table. I'd bring in some sushi and some beer and invite some of my friends down that were video game designers and programmers and artists. We would sit around the table and try to figure out how we can work together, how we can use their skill sets, their experience in building very powerful, commercially powerful entertainment software that people love to use, and how we can frame it within the context of the paradigms and the controls that we think are necessary to have the endpoints that we're looking for, the outcomes. And it was an amazing experience, I think, for everyone over the last years that we've been doing that. You learn a lot of what I always make this joke that if there was an outside observer, an alien just watching the room and didn't realize that there were a mix of scientists and video game professionals in the room and tried to look at what we were doing, they would think it was those guys over there, their job to make it fun, and that those folks, their job is to make it not fun. And we frequently were in that the scientists in the room were in that horrible position of being like, that's not going to work. So
it's not economics.
Yeah, I mean, we need a lot of control. And control is not fun, to some degree. And so we had a compromise, which was exactly why we brought together two disparate groups, is to say, okay, well, maybe we can sacrifice a little bit of control for a little bit of fun, and on the flip side, move away from just the pure entertainment value and try to keep some of the things that we think are necessary to have plasticity in the brain. So it was an amazing experience, and now we're taking it to the next step, and we're working with new companies companies that we're helping to develop that are even diving deeper and bringing in people that are eventually going to do this full time and develop cognitive video games.
Is it possible that these distractions can launch sort of a brain response that may make somebody feel like you're getting an endorphin or some positive, happy signals? And could you optimize your distractions and literally trigger like a euphoric state while playing the video game? Are you gonna? Is this something in the realm of the possibility?
Well, you frequently hear descriptions like that in the context of multitasking, right? So people like, okay, we get it. Multitasking decreases performance. It certainly could be dangerous if you're doing it while you're driving. It's probably not great for the education process. It destroys families. Everyone's sitting around the table with iPhones in their hand and Androids and texting all the time. So we know we're starting to get the burden of this, but yet we do it a lot. And so people ask the question, why do we do it? We know it has these negative consequences, and that's where you hear a lot of discussions of reward, of the reward of switching onto something novel, and that gives us a little dopamine burst, and it feeds our reward system, and it's something that reinforces the act of switching again and again. So we see that there's not a lot of primary research on it in the true tech domain of looking at how this might occur for media multitasking, but it certainly is intuitively plausible that this is a driving force for it. And in video games, that's certainly a big part of it, especially first-person shooter games. You're constantly immersed in a world of switching and distraction and multitasking, and I think that if we do it in a controlled manner, and maybe even without the violent elements, we would be able to train these abilities, and it would actually be fun as well.
Well, I think violence in, but that's just me.
We can do Portal 2.
Violence is an interesting question, right? I mean, there's been a lot of data that shows that action video games, first-person shooters, improve attentional abilities. Yes. And they are violent. And so it would be interesting to see if you strip out the violence, are the effects as robust? Is the violent aspects part of these therapeutic effects on attention? That answer is unknown right now, but it's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, an old prof of mine, Ian Spence, who's my stats prof at U of T when I was in grad school, and him and a couple of his students had the standard sort of spatial difference that you find, spatial ability difference on average between men and women. And after playing Call of Duty 3 on the 360 for 2 hours, the difference disappeared between the men and the women. So getting women to play this game somehow, made them better at spatial tasks, which is almost mind-boggling. Of course, it's a very spatially driven task playing a first-person shooter.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of data along those lines of attentional and distractibility effects. I mean, the literature is filling up with them. It's actually pretty impressive. Of all the things, all the training that we try to develop that don't really transfer very well, these first-person shooter action video games actually show a tremendous amount of transfer. So there's something there that was stumbled on by accident. It was not the goals. The goals were entertainment. So it's interesting to try to learn lessons from that.
At some point, we're going to yell at our kids, will you put that book down and start playing Call of Duty?
You don't need to do that. Kids right now, man, even at 4 or 5 years old, they're better gamers than, my son. First time he played when Google did Pac-Man, the icon, the Google icon became a Pac-Man game. First time he'd ever seen Pac-Man, he cleared 4 screens. I remember playing Pac-Man. I still can't clear 4 screens. Maybe I could try maybe after 5th, 6th game, but these kids today are dramatically changed with the ability of gaming. I mean, there's no question. Much like the same way my parents can't program a VCR, right? My kids on the other side of the generation can literally wipe out an entire village in a 3D shoot 'em game. Anyway, not that they play Portal 2. They don't play any violent games.
Now, my kid who just walked in here, but I told him to leave. He actually plays quite a bit of violent video games now and then. Shooter games, not Grand Theft Auto, but he plays shooter games. My son also, he's high functioning autistic. He's 10, and one of the things about autism is that, they get distracted to a point of obsession. If we brought John in here right now, which I'm not going to do because he'd take over the show, we could ask him about any plane crash that has ever happened. Or any day of the week, and he can tell you when a plane has crashed and what kind of plane was being flown and who was flying it, etc. It's kind of cool in its own way. It really is. It's kind of a neat thing. But what ends up happening, of course, is he gets so distracted, in essence, by this kind of stuff that he sometimes doesn't pay attention to important things. Like, instead of reading his schoolwork, he's got my iPad and he's reading Wikipedia about airplane crashes. And I mean, there's a whole school of thought out there that autism is basically an executive functioning disorder. Do you think that there's possible therapeutic value for people, say, with autism or ADHD in this kind of, using this kind of approach, this sort of make it fun, make it interesting, but also make it, make it a game?
Without a doubt. I think that there is tremendous potential for a whole new set of therapeutics that are built on this concept, that they're fun, they're enjoyable, they're engaging, but they have real validated endpoints across many different populations. In my own realm of looking at interference resolution and processing of multiple tasks and distraction, I see so many populations as needing assistance in that domain. I mean, if you look at things like different conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and even traumatic brain injury, ADHD, as you already mentioned, we see it in dementia. Almost all of these conditions have some problem, these individuals, some problem with dealing with interference. So I hope that by learning how to design these really engaging and enjoyable video games that can teach us how to resolve interference better and be more efficient at switching between tasks, that they will have positive and therapeutic benefits across many populations. Of course, the burden is on us then to show that it works, to study it in a careful way, just like we do for drugs, just like all therapeutics that reach clinical endpoints are studied. So I think that that's going to be a really exciting trend that we see occurring over the next 5 years.
Nice. Let me just interject here. I think one thing that would be fun is if you could participate in one of the upcoming episodes. So there's a new show that's going to be on soon on Twit, and it's going to be a LAN Party, a gaming show. And you're going to have some of the best gamers in the world going up to San Francisco and or Petaluma, which is not very far. And you might get some of the top, well, you probably already know many of them. So, but it'd be really interesting also to, make this somewhat public while you're doing your study and have an active participation by the gaming community. And that would be one way to get an incredible amount of active participation and feedback as to some of the things that make the game more real or not real in the experience. And I think if you mentioned too, as you said, there's people who make it fun and then people who make it, not fun. I think by taking the advice of people that make it fun, you're going to make it more real. Certainly make it more not just real, but more relevant to the future of that whole, understanding of how we interact with computers and that next level of the digital life, right? Like how to use a GUI, how many windows is too many? How do you design a window that has less of a distraction but more functional based on the structure of our human mind?
I love that idea. I mean, it's one of my main platforms is to leave, this concept of the ivory tower that we invented all in academics and figure it all out. Just doesn't work for me. I like the idea of bringing in individuals that are experts in their field that are not scientists but have lots of experience and lots of intuition, and that's something that's really exciting for me to do. And my lab enjoys having all those different influences, and I think it gives us a real advantage in creating things and even in studying them is to have those inputs. And it's an advantage of being in San Francisco. We have so many wonderful inventors in so many different fields in this area, and I think that it's actually been a detriment of academics and the healthcare industry that we haven't reached out as much as we could.
I'd like to ask if you foresee working with individuals that are unique in the world, geniuses in certain areas, geniuses in music, geniuses in math, geniuses in art, different sections of the brain that are very prominent, geniuses in memory, and see if, is there any extremes in the people with extreme minds that would have different uses of the structures in the brain that could allow a bypassing of distraction and allow for multitasking. As you say, we're only have a single core brain function. There's no hyper-threading on two processes, right? You just you can't get distracted without cost. Are you going to do any extreme individuals, or is it right now? Are you going with the mass population, general?
Yeah, I think we're baby stepping over to that. So medical research in general pays attention to populations. That's what you need to get drugs approved, right? You have to show that this population that you predefine shows a change that's greater than a placebo, for example. And that makes a lot of sense because you want to market and target it widely. But the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of individual differences. This is starting to be recognized in this concept of personalized medicine, that what might be good for the population might differ for certain individuals within that population. And so and science has really started to embrace this, especially cognitive neuroscience. We are spending more and more attention, paying attention, focusing on not just what we're seeing on average, but how it might differ dramatically across the population, across the individuals in the population. And so we see that all the time. We see even, within any population, we tend to study healthy younger and older adults. We'll see an older adult that will come in, a 60 or 70-year-old that will come into our experiment, and all of a sudden we'll see them performing like they're 23 years old, and way, many standard deviations beyond the mean of their age group. So we haven't been seeking out extraordinarily gifted or exceptional individuals, but we're starting to pay more attention to individual differences, and that would be a very fun way of doing it. We haven't embarked on that, but I would certainly be interested.
Has Google, Microsoft, Apple, maybe you can't talk about it, but have they approached you? I know that you're on a board of directors, or you're a scientific advisory board for an advertising company that's using, or maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, or can you?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think there is an increasing interest from companies to take advantage or to capitalize on advances made in understanding the brain, as well as the tools that we use to understand the brain, like EEG, to record electrical activity while people are engaged in looking at their products, or engaged in their software, or looking at different advertising. So there's a lot of interest in it. I'm excited about that interest. I'm also hesitant about it because it's challenging, and I get concerned that the appeal, the almost what seems to be a universal appeal with the brain, which is great, I love that, can be used in ways that are entirely not fair when we have not done our homework and really controlled for everything. So part of me is incredibly excited. I want to participate in it, largely to help use the rigor that we use in lab and in science, and not allow the brain to just be a marketing tool, but actually offer something of value. And I hope that's where we're going. It's the very beginning, so things are crazy now at the beginning, where we're just realizing that neuroscience can interact with so many diverse fields, but hopefully we'll get it under control and do it the right way.
I wouldn't be afraid of some of the uses of understanding the mind to be able to control the audience, or not the audience. That's what I'm doing here. Or the clients, the customers, right? People are smart, and they will quickly adapt to that next level of advertising and then blow it off. For example, you take a Happy Meal, right? You go to McDonald's, you get an average hamburger or some fries, but then you get a toy as a kid. And that makes you have that warm, fuzzy feeling that, 20 years down the line, you remember the good times you had getting this new toy, this surprise, coincided with food. And then you get this, reward, stimuli, and memory that's just very, very positive. right? And that's an incredible marketing technique. The guy who figured that out is just an incredible genius. I mean, it was a paradigm shift, I think, in marketing. Well, you can use that, right? If you're a parent, you've got a kid, you take him to the library, and then you slip him a candy bar, right? A little bite-sized candy bar. Every time he finishes a book, say, "Hey, look, let's take a break and give him a snack." Do that a few times, then he'll be going to the library thinking, "Wow, this is good." I don't know.
I agree with you. I agree. I think, and my fear wasn't on that level that we'd have this incredible ability to read brains, that we could control people like sheep. I mean, I'm not really concerned about that because I don't think that that's going to happen. My concern was just that we don't. That we say we looked inside the brain and we saw some activity, and therefore this is good. That my fear is not using the data in a rigorous way, but just the appeal that there is brain data. Okay. But it's really an exciting opportunity that now all of these other industries have interest in what we're doing and the tools that we use. So I think it's going to be an incredible experience as we see that develop over the next 5 to 10 years.
When you talk about any brain data, one of the things we haven't talked about is when you look at the sort of control of the sort of top-down control, this getting rid of distraction, etc. Are these pretty complicated circuits? Are we talking about many areas lighting up at once? I mean, I'm pretty darn sure we're not talking about, yes, the distraction area is just right there. So, I mean, what's actually going on as far as what areas are lighting up? What areas are being used when we are trying to avoid distraction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start a little fundamental in how I view this, and a lot of us think about this, is that we in some ways there's almost a paradigm shift, not in how we think about it, but how we study it. So people often talk about this area lights up, or there's a blob of activity here, and a lot of that is true. There's tons of functional specialization in the brain, but sort of as you alluded to, higher order abilities emerge from the interactions of multiple brain areas. And the brain is an incredibly complex multivariate network. And it's been really hard to study the brain like that. It makes sense the way we did study it for a long time, which is, what is this area involved in? What is this area involved in? And now more and more of us, and my lab is almost exclusively trying to move in that direction, are looking at understanding brain networks. And sometimes even that we do too superficially. So we're guilty of it also. We'll look at how the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive control area. It's a part of our brain that's most human, the part that's most evolved, that allows us to control how we interact with our environment, both perceptually and motorically. We look at how the areas in the prefrontal cortex are functionally connected to sensory areas like visual cortices of the brain, and how it modulates activity based on your goals, and how that modulation impacts your memory. So that's a very frequent way that we study it. And so we know that, and I think across the field there would be a lot of confidence in agreeing with that there are functional connections between the prefrontal cortex and sensory cortices, which are usually in the back part of your brain, and that this connection allows us to navigate through distracting environments and stick to our goals, and that this part of the brain also allows us to switch our goals based on our priorities. But it's still a very simplified way of looking at it, because there are many other areas, the parietal cortex, the temporal cortex, areas, subcortical areas like the thalamus and the basal ganglia, that are also part of this very complicated network. So hopefully, as we now move away from what we call univariate methods of looking at areas of brain in isolation to now looking at how areas interact, we'll get more and more sophisticated and really think, and a lot of people are doing this right now, think about the brain as a network.
Right. So sort of the classic idea, going back to Hebb, of the cell assembly kind of thing, but even writ larger.
Oh, yeah. Way larger, way more intricate. And there's so many things that complicate this. For example, you might think you know what a brain area is doing, but it's really only doing that in the context of what other brain areas are doing at the same time, and in the context of what else is going on around it, the context, the goals, the environment, the situation. So you think you have a rule, and then you realize that that rule is a contextual element and can change very much even in sometimes in an opposite direction depending on the context and what other brain areas are engaged. So
Right.
it's as you'd expect. It's very, very complicated, but it's obvious that it's complicated. Look at how amazing and how deep our interactions with the environment is, and how seamless it is, as you started us off today, where all of this is occurring below, our level of detecting it.
Yeah. As Charles Darwin said, there is grandeur in this view of life. It's an amazing thing.
It is definitely. I'm in awe of it. It's a fun thing to study.
It's literally awesome. Yeah.
It is awesome.
Yeah.
It's almost like I'd hate to say it. Freud is now in the 21st century. You can really study the inner workings of the mind with some exquisite sensitivity.
You had to bring up Freud, did you? Okay. That's the only psychologists aren't that proud of Freud.
Okay. Fraser? Sorry.
How about Wilhelm Wundt?
Okay. Yes. That's why I brought you, Dave. You're a subject matter expert, and clearly you raised the level of conversation here. You certainly helped. Thank you.
But I try to mix it up. So
I just like to point out that some of the imaging studies that you're doing to map how these challenges that you present to the patient or the person are mapped is through blood flow in the brain by MRI, right? Is that how it works? So you can measure what's active and not? You use three methods.
Yeah, we use three methods. So I'll just briefly go through those. So we use functional MRI, which is, I'm sure it's familiar to most people what an MRI machine is. I won't go through the physics of it, but while most MRIs are looking at, or classically are looking at structure, how the anatomical components are organized, what size they are, the density. New techniques, which use the same basic machinery but have different pulse sequences, allow us to look at how blood flow changes when you are engaged in a task. And so by looking at how blood flow changes gives us a correlate of how neural activity changes. There it is on my website, a little description of it, because we know that when you use a brain area more, it demands more blood flow, and so it is a marker of activity. And the next tool that we use is right there on that page. It's EEG. And EEG is a nice complement to fMRI because instead of looking at blood flow correlates of neural activity, it's looking at electrical correlates of electrical signatures of neural activity. And so what it allows you to do is look at when events are occurring in the brain in real time. So, but it doesn't see exactly where they're happening. So fMRI lets us see with pretty good precision down to like a cubic millimeter of where events are occurring, but it has poor time resolution because the blood flow response is delayed. But EEG lets us see when it's occurring. So we use them both in conjunction to learn where and how networks are formed, and also to understand when events are occurring. But a limitation of both those techniques is that they're correlational. They only show you how events in the brain are associated with a certain type of behavior. So if you want to go a step further and say, okay, maybe it's associated, but maybe it's not causing that behavior, what you have to do is then perturb the brain area and see what the consequences are on behavior. So for that, we use a tool called transcranial magnetic stimulation, also known as TMS. And what
I don't
TMS
like the sound
does,
of that.
So it's scary. It's not that scary.
It's cool.
What
It's cool
TMS
to watch,
does-
though, Mark.
Sorry, I
Come down to
interrupted.
the lab,
Go ahead.
we'll give you a blast. And basically what TMS is a very high magnetic field that's pulsed through the scalp very briefly, and it causes neurons to fire. You can see a picture of it there on our website. It causes neurons to fire below the stimulator. And that stimulation causes of the neuron causes an effect. So if you do it over the motor cortex on one side of your body, your finger might move on the other side of your body, which is how the signal is transmitted across your spinal cord. If you do it in a repetitive manner, let's say at a slow frequency at like 1 hertz, what happens is that the area is perturbed for a short period of time and not functioning at the level that it was beforehand, and it recovers around over the period of time that equals how long you were stimulating. So if you stimulate for 10 minutes, it's slightly perturbed for 10 minutes. And during that period of time, but it's very focal, around the size of a dime. So during that period of time, what we do is record behavior, have you engage in these experiments, and also record brain activity with EEG to see how control works, how the prefrontal cortex is guiding modulation in, let's say, the visual parts of your brain by looking at it with EEG. So we now do experiments. We actually just published a paper earlier this year, a couple months ago, that used all three tools. I think it's the first of its kind to use all three tools in this way. We used functional MRI to find areas in the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that might be involved in the control of how you pay attention and how you remember things. And then we brought those participants back on a second day, and on the second day they did the same memory experiment, but not with fMRI. They did it with EEG recordings before and after we did TMS that perturbed activity in the front part of the brain that we identified with fMRI. So we used a stereotaxic localization system, sort of what you might use in the operating room to guide a surgeon's hands, so that we could find the area in their brain that was connected, functionally connected with the visual areas the day before, and then perturb that area. And so what we found was that these areas that we find with fMRI are just not correlationally related, but when we perturb them, we change the modulation of activity in the visual parts of the brain, and we change their memory performance in a correlated way. And so what this does is it uses all of our tools to really allow us to truly map out the brain, how brain areas are communicating with each other to lead to these higher order behaviors like memory. Fun stuff.
What a crossroads.
Yeah.
What a crossroads of technology and psychology. Not that psychology isn't technological. It's, I mean, I'm thinking, I can't stop but thinking, do you know Raul Sarpeshkar at all?
No.
So the low voltage, ultra low voltage sort of brain machine interfaces that he's designing. He's got sensors that can decode the analog signal of the retina and translate it into a digital signal and vice versa. And he's making some really, really wild stuff. I'm just amazed. There's some incredible technology here.
Sure.
Asking some of the fundamental questions of the human mind. And I think, you're probably one of the few guests that really is at that crossroads that is relevant to TWIT at an exquisite level. So I think we're going to be following your work. I'm glad. So I have to thank Luke Lightning for introducing us.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he introduced us and proposed you as a potential guest, and I'm really glad he did.
For sure.
I think if we have anything further, it should be left for a second show, because we've really covered the functioning of the human mind with respect to distraction, or at least got a teaser. I mean, you can't talk about this in an hour and a half. This is really, probably a full 6-credit course, and a book and potentially a Nobel Prize down the road. But let's just cross our fingers and hope that this science doesn't slow down, but it speeds up. Because it's a hell of a lot of fun. Hey, this has been a tremendous journey. I don't know. Is there any final thoughts because I might be missing stuff here too. Did I miss anything, Dave?
I don't know. I mean, this is exactly what I wanted to happen. And I mean, like I said at the beginning, I mean, this a fundamental part of being a human being is our ability to put all of this stuff together and also ignore so much useless crap that's happening. And then sometimes the stuff that seems useless actually is really important. And we switch these, we just do this seamlessly. It really, as I said before, when I said awesome, it really is literally awe-inspiring in me that we can do this. And there are, as much as most of my work and my training has been with animals, there are days when I think humans are pretty cool.
Is there any special paperwork you need to do experiments on humans?
It's actually, I think, a lot more stringent for first-year undergraduates than it is for rats and monkeys and such.
Oh my God! I think about just doing some mice experiments over a case. You end up waiting for committee to decide 6 weeks later. It's so rough that I've decided to create my own animal facility. Let's just say that. But I'm now an expert with respect to Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare and the AAA LAC and the other agencies to make sure I make procedure. We're going to be talking about blast of the brain, something we're going to be doing for blast TBI, which is something we're exploring here to protect our soldiers with neuroprotectants. I'd really like to thank you for coming on the show. Do you have any final thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, it was a great pleasure, and I really appreciate you inviting me. This is my mission, exactly. Shows like this and reaching out to different audiences that don't know what we're doing in the lab and where our experiments are going, because I am entirely convinced that we are not going to get there just by remaining within the influences of people in the field. We want to engage people in biotech and high tech and of all sorts of different industries, because there's going to be insights there that I think are going to lead to the really fundamental changes that need to be made. And personally, I am very excited when people reach out to me from different fields and say, hey, let's get together, and I just want to tell you about what I do and hear a little bit more about what you do and see if we could find a common crossroads there. And so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak about what I do to this audience, because I think that this is the direction that we all need to move in.
I'd like to mention Replicant X3R0 in the chat room mentioned that the name of the show that's coming is going to be called Game On, and the first the first Game On episode will be the day of the barbecue. So that will be, looking at the show notes here, November 13th. I think, or Sunday the 4th. I think it's November 13th. And you should send a couple of postdocs up there to really stimulate the conversation. And you know, there's a study in there somewhere. If we could just wheel up an MRI and throw, I won't say the names of the hosts, but throw the hosts into the MRI while they're gaming, it'd be really, God damn it. It'd be pretty exciting.
That sounds
great.
We
could throw Leo into that MRI. You might find some very novel stuff. Well, thank you very, very much for coming on. Our guest today was Dr. Adam Gazzaley, who's Associate Professor in Neurology, Physiology, Psychiatry, and the Director of the Neuroscience and Founding Director of the Neuroscience Imaging Center at University of California in San Francisco. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. It's great being here.
I'd also like to thank Dr. Dave Brodbeck, who's Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychology at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Thank you, Dave, for coming on. You keep us on topic, and thanks for your help today.
It's always a pleasure, Marc. It's always fun.
Again, I'd like to thank Luke Lightning for suggesting Dr. Gazzaley as a guest and making the introduction, making the show possible. Liz Romero handled the audio and video boards today and the recordings. Thank you. Much appreciated. I'd also like to thank our Chief Twit, Leo Laporte, for making this possible, and the great team in Petaluma. If you have any comments or suggestions, it can be reached at marc@twit.tv. That's marc@twit.tv, or on Twitter at Marc Pelletier, MarcPletier. I think that's it. So for Futures in Biotech, I'm Marc Pelletier.